talk has come out of a series of consults that we've had for the T-REX consult service through the bioethics program. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the 3 consults and then talk about some broad issues in research in schools. So here are our 3 consults. The first was a diabetes prevention researcher who wanted to recruit adolescents in a high poverty school for a focus group on potential obesity interventions. She was having problems with parental consent and having kids return consent forms into the school, and had questions about waivers of parental consent and innovative approaches to consent. The second consult was an educational researcher in the School of Social Work who wanted to examine how educational neuroscience techniques were operationalized in the classrooms. Educational neuroscience is a hot new area in teaching, and with multiple teacher training programs across the country. She had been working with a teacher in one of the Indianapolis area schools, and they wanted to see how these played out in real life. And then the third consult was from a program evaluator who wanted to administer behavioral surveys before and after an evidence-based adolescent sex education program, and had questions about consent approaches again, so all focused on consent. So what I'd like to talk about 3 things today from an ethics perspective in working with schools. And the first is engagement with the school community. The second will be privacy and data security. And the third is issues around consent, or in pediatrics, parental permission and child assent. My one caveat is I'm really talking about minimal risk research in schools. Research that's greater than minimal risk falls in a different category in terms of consent. So I'm going to limit myself here, but also minimal risk captures the bulk of school research. So schools are really special cases of community engaged research. When I started in adolescent medicine, our pediatric psychologist sat me down and said, "Mary, remember this. The principal is the king of the castle, and parents are important." And it's something that I've carried with me in adolescent medicine and in adolescent ethics. But schools are small communities. The principal and administrators are really leaders, are community stakeholders and community leaders. And we need to think about using community engaged principles when we work with schools. I like to think about the school as the co-investigator, bringing them on really early in the process, getting their input on methods, when to survey kids, how to survey them, how to get consent. Again, as a special case of community engaged research, the other piece about schools is that research really needs to be grounded in trust. Schools go a little bit out on a limb when they work with researchers. They make themselves vulnerable. And trust building is a really critical part of research engaged in schools. The third piece of community engaged research to think about is that you can harm not just individual children, but there can be harms to the school community. So community engaged research typically thinks about harms to the community. But as we look at this, we need to think about harms to the school and really assess what the principals and the administrators' views are in terms of what get their concerns about the research. The next part, sort of key ethics issue in community engaged research, is providing results back to schools. Because the schools, one of the reasons that the schools generally genuinely want to know what's going on with their students. If you have enough students, you can provide the data back in a de-identified manner. What I typically do when I work with schools is I'll write up our sort of aggregate report, my research report, and then I'll reanalyze the data, breaking it down by each school, and then meet with the school and go over what their data were specifically prior to releasing the larger report. I'll give them sort of like a column with their entire school in a column with the entire study. And so making them, and it's again sort of applying principles of community engaged research to schools. And then the last thing is back to my pediatric psychology mentor, is like really thinking about how parents should be involved, how parents can be involved. Parents are really key stakeholders in school communities. So schools, even where there are waivers of parental consent, schools will oftentimes want parents to be notified. So thinking about like what types of parental permission, how to get parental permission, how to do notification is really important. So the second area of ethics that I recommend that people think about are thinking about privacy and data security. So when privacy in school-based research has to do with sort of the knowledge that the young person is participating, and whereas data security really is sort of their actual data and results, and thinking about chains of security with their results. And both of these are important, and important not just in research on sensitive issues like sexuality research, but it's important across the board. In the first example, it was a diabetes prevention study. She was doing research actually with kids who met BMI criteria for participation in the focus group. So she's working with heavier kids, and there's stigma associated with weight. So even just participating is an issue. So paying attention to these young people's privacy, making sure the data are collected in a way that other students aren't aware of the young person's permission. A colleague of mine in adolescent medicine did a tobacco cessation intervention in a school. And it was very important to make sure that kids that they had an equal intervention for non-smokers, so that the smokers weren't sort of pulled aside and stigmatized. So privacy ends up being a big concern. Schools are public places. It's also hard to predict what families will consider sensitive. One of my current studies is an evaluation of a teen pregnancy prevention program in a rural school, and our community collaborator was less worried about asking about sexual behavior and more worried about asking about family income. In their community, family income was a very sensitive issue. They knew it was a sex education program. They knew we would ask about sex, but they didn't feel that it was our right to ask about family income. So it was only in sort of working with the school as thinking about a community engaged approach that we pulled this out, and sort of thinking to them, what's private, what's important, what do we need to be concerned about. HIPAA is something that all of us who work in or around health organizations need to be concerned about. It deals with data security, and when we do school-based research, we need to be very careful about identifiers and study numbers. Is who has access to the keys, which have the kid's name and their study number. Is it something that's held at the school? Is it something that's held at the research office? These are just things to consider before starting. And then very practical matters are like chains of data security. Like usually, when we're doing research in clinics, the young person is at the clinic, they're in a private room, we get the information, oftentimes it's uploaded directly into a web-based portal. But when you're in a classroom with our sex education researcher surveying 23 kids, he's going to have paper surveys. Those paper surveys are going to be numbered. They're going to need to have identifiers separated from them. They're going to need to be collected. They're going to need to be reviewed to make sure all the questions are answered. Once they're collected, they're going to need to get to the place where they're going to be stored. And these pieces, there's just more chaos in school. There are more steps in the process of getting data collected in schools to the place where the data will be stored and entered. So chains of data security end up being important and thinking, and again, it's sort of one of these like sort of points to consider ahead of time. Making sure a lot of researchers will be there with laptops or tablets or phones. And just we typically think about password protecting and encrypting laptops, but we don't always think about password protecting and encrypting our tablets and our phones. But schools are public places, and making sure all of our electronic devices are password protected and encrypted. And then thinking about data storage and data security, that we're in a firewalled, and if you're in the health field, HIPAA compliant way to store data. So privacy and data security, these are like sort of our main risks and main concerns. And again, sort of you really working through them from the front end is going to be is going to save you on the back end. So I was talking about HIPAA in the last slide, but it turns out like education research is doubly difficult because you have two sets of regulations. You do not just have HIPAA, but you have FERPA. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and FERPA is a federal law that deals with the release of and access to educational records. All institutions that receive federal education dollars, which is really almost all schools, even private and charter schools, receive federal dollars in some way, shape, or form, are required to follow FERPA requirements. And a key piece of FERPA is that private records of young people are not released without the written consent of their parent if they're a minor. FERPA deals with, unlike HIPAA, deals with health records, and we have our 17 HIPAA identifiers with your name and medical record number and date of birth and age if you're over 85 years of age. Well, FERPA deals with educational records, and so it's also helpful to know what records are considered records for FERPA. One of them is class rosters. So a class roster is considered protected information. Grades, exams, and transcripts are considered protected information. Health records, if they're owned by the school, so immunization records, things like that. Discipline records, student schedules, and then any thing that teachers or schools have that's written about students. So notes, they could be handwritten notes, they could be computer files, they could be emails. These are all protected by FERPA. So a school-based researcher needs to consider these other protected areas. So for instance, our researcher looking at educational neuroscience was thinking about like class lists as a way to recruit. But all of a sudden you're thinking about using a protected type of information to recruit. And so, and you technically should get parental consent before recruiting for that. So she came up with an alternative strategy in collaboration with the teacher because class lists are considered protected. FERPA does have exceptions. One of the exceptions is developing, validating, and administering predictive tests. For organizations that are doing, these would be sort of like our Indiana state exams. These might be like Isaacs for private schools, administering student aid programs, or improving instructions. And the researcher must have a written agreement from the school about, like essentially a contract or a memorandum of understanding for this to count as an exception. And these really end up being things that schools, these are organizations that schools contract with to provide essential services for families. So parental permission. Going back to my child psychologist colleague who said, the parents are key in school. So parental permission in general is not really consent, which is why I deliberately use the word permission. It's a form of surrogate decision making. It's based on the ethical assumption that parents usually make decisions in the best interest of their children. However, issues can arise and challenge this ethical assumption when there's a conflict of interest between the parent and child, when parental permission introduces some type of risk to the child, or parental permission is a barrier such that it to the research or changes the data such that it's not accurate. And some of these issues have came up with our 3 consults. So for instance, the study doing focus groups with children for diabetes prevention had a lot of these kids came from communities that had high levels of poverty. There was a lot of family chaos, and they just had a really low return of parental permission slips. And the kids that returned the parental permission slips were different than the kids that didn't return them. And this is a population that has extraordinarily high rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So it's the very population, the very kids that would be the target of the intervention were the kids that were unable to return the permission slips because of family chaos. And so there may be situations where parental permission, active parental permission, would be something that would influence the research in a way that would, in this case, make it less accurate. The study on sex education had a survey about adolescent sexual behaviors. And these are things that young people typically consent to on their own. Information about sexuality is typically protected information. Kids would typically be able to give their own consent for this type of information, particularly at a high school level. So again, sometimes there are conflicts that come up. So this is sort of what I've talked about on the last slide, particularly with sensitive topics. Parental permission can compromise science. So we talked about diabetes with the last one. This is a published study that was a natural experiment. They had a group in a children's hospital that was validating the CRAFT screen, which is a drug use risk screen. Did you use drugs or alcohol in a car? Have you used them to relax? Do you use them alone? Do you use them with friends? Have your friends told you to stop? Have you ever gotten into trouble for using drugs and alcohol? In the first study, they got a waiver of parental permission, and they adapted their scale, and then they redid it. However, the institution, the medical school where they worked, had a change in policy, and they changed their parental consent policy. And whereas they gave a waiver for the first round, they didn't give a waiver for the second round. And what they found is that participants in the first study had a different ethnic makeup. They were more able to recruit ethnic minorities, and also had kids that scored higher on the CRAFT score, so kids with higher risk for substance use, when there was a waiver of parental consent. It was the same population, same clinic. The parental consent changed their results. So it was this sort of natural experiment that really demonstrated the importance of attending to issues around consent, and thinking about how it would play out in terms of data quality. The other question that sometimes comes up with consent is, are the young people able to consent? Because a key piece of parental consent is that it's a protection. It gives like an extra consenter to assure that it's a valid consent. In pediatric research, people oftentimes question whether the child has the capacity to consent. Dutch Children's Hospital group did a study that provided some key data on this. They took every child participating in a clinical trial in a large children's hospital. These clinical trials cross subspecialties and types of trials. So they had kids in GI and oncology and other types of trials. And then they took an adult capacity assessment tool, the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for Clinical Research, adapted it and administered it to the young people. And what the MATCAT does is that it looks at whether young people can understand the results. It looks at whether young people can reason, can weigh risks and benefits, whether they appreciate how the research might affect them themselves, and it assesses whether they can make a voluntary choice. And what this Dutch group found was in kids under 9.5, competence was unlikely. In kids over 11, competence was probable, and the optimal cutoff, statistically speaking, was about 10.5 years of age. I mean, so what they're saying is that by about, at least 11, by 10.5 to 11, young people can understand, reason, appreciate how the research would affect them themselves, and make a voluntary choice. I mean, we're not talking about optimal decision making, but we're talking about like sort of threshold decision making. Can they make decisions the same way adults can? And if you translate this to schools, what you're looking at is middle school and high school students. Because if you think about, kids are 10 going into 11 in 5th grade. So 6th grade on, we can feel comfortable that in many situations, young people do have the capacity to consent. So waivers of parental permission. So waivers are allowed in medical research. The two big regulatory guidelines in the United States are Subpart D of the Common Rule, which provides waivers for abused or neglected children. And then the National Commission's report on research involving children from 1973. And what the National Commission's report talks about are conditions for which adolescents may obtain treatment without parental permission. So sexuality research, STD research would fall here. Research with mature minors, which presents not more than minimal risk. And then the last two cases, parents who are legally or functionally incompetent or boards of the court, you might waive parental permission, but you would have to have some type of substitute consent process in its place. But it's the first two that really are relevant to school-based research. Number 2 is sort of loose, mature minors, minimal risk, but it's really spelled out later on because I'm going to go two more, because we allow waivers of parental permission when we allow waivers of adult written informed consent. And these are cases where the research is minimal risk. It won't affect the rights and welfare of the adolescent. It could not practically be carried out as otherwise, and if appropriate, adolescents will be provided with additional pertinent information after participation. And finally, the research can't be FDA regulated. So this is our diabetes prevention study. It's clearly minimal risk. It won't affect their rights and welfare. They're not even being asked about their own particular behaviors. They're being asked more broadly on how they feel about interventions and to talk about what might be effective for the groups of children similar to them. And it certainly, the researcher had demonstrated that it couldn't practically be carried out without a waiver. I'm going to go back to and think about 2 slides and talk about our sexuality research example. So the regulatory definition of children isn't under 18. It actually has to do with whether young people have attained the legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in the research. And the legal age is dependent on the applicable law of the jurisdiction in which the research would be conducted. So for a situation where we're looking at STD research, young people can consent for STDs. So young people aren't children with respect to STD research, and Subpart D doesn't apply. This is purely a regulatory argument, but if you look at how children are defined, when we think about like what our parental consent requirements are from a regulatory perspective, in certain areas like STD research, our young people might not be considered children, and Subpart D may not be required.
Can I ask a point of information?
Yes.
I don't want to interrupt the flow at all, but it's just to remind you of how ignorant the rest of us are about adolescent medicine. So I didn't really know that adolescents could get treatment without parental consent for anything. So is there a cutoff in age when you can start getting treatment for STDs without parental consent, or is it even a 7-year-old?
There are sort of like functional cutoffs. So there's no cutoff in the law, in the consent law. But other laws require us to involve parents. So, for instance, if we know that a very young child is involved in sexual activity, we need to report it as child abuse. So the 7-year-old, I would,
Yeah, of course.
would involve families. Also,
And
like
that's
from
the
an
practitioner's judgment when it crosses over from young person probably engaging in voluntary.
no, there's laws around
There's
that
laws
of
of
when
age
to
that is-
report. Yeah,
gotcha.
like our sort of reporting requirements are all specified in law. So there are reporting laws. I mean, there's also sort of the ethics of it. So, I mean, if you think to the Hein results, like, I would feel very comfortable having a 14-year-old consent
Right.
based on her results. I would feel much less comfortable looking at a 7-year-old provide consent. So. And so your question as to laws, here are some of our Indiana laws. So our age of majority is 18. The exceptions would be emancipated minors who would be treated as if they were adults. You can be emancipated by court order, by living apart, or by being married, and by being active duty in military service. We also have waivers based on diagnoses. So STDs would be one of those waivers, substance use treatment, young people can donate blood.
Really? Those
yes,
three
and
things.
blood. Yeah,
STDs.
there are. Those are 3 things that are in the law. Examples of 3 examples that are in the law. Yeah. So this is our broader context. But now we're going to go back because I started the talk by talking about schools as being sort of this microcosm of community engaged research and thinking about schools as communities and administrators as stakeholders and parents as important stakeholders. So so that brings us to sort of, opting in and opting out. The one additional thing I would like to say about minimal risk for anyone who's looking at this, if you need to know what's minimal risk for school children in healthcare, there are actually guidelines on best practices like Bright Futures and Academy of Pediatrics and CDC and U.S. Preventative Services Task Force recommendations. So if you are doing health research and want to know sort of what's considered standard of care and ordinary routine tests, then you can go here and look. So for instance, for our diabetes prevention research, if she wanted to add on a hemoglobin A1C, it still could potentially be minimal risk because that's a standard part of healthcare for young people. It's a screening test. Recommended screening. So the last thing I want to talk about is opt-out consent. And this is really important for schools because schools really like opt-out parental consent. And the reason why they like it is because it involves parents, but it also recognizes the need that adolescents you might want to waive consent for practicability reasons. You might want to waive consent because it's a parental consent because it's a sensitive issue. My ethics colleagues never fail to remind me that opt-out consent is not really consent because you haven't closed the circle. Like what happens with opt-out consent is you inform parents about what's going to happen in the school. So with a sex education program, I, in fact, just recently got an email from my 12-year-old's class that they were going to have their sex education program in the next 2 weeks, and I could go to parents' night next week. So they have informed me about it, and then I read through the email, and they say if I don't want my young person to participate in this, they'll provide an alternate activity. They can sit with the school with the school secretary and work on extra math homework or something like that. And and so and if I would like that option, I can call the school and avail myself of that option. If I don't call the school, then my 12-year-old will participate in the sex education program. So that's an example of opt-out parental consent. So not really consent because you haven't assessed. I mean, for consent is a process by which you impart information and you assess the person for understanding. And so no one has assessed whether I ever received the information because, like, sometimes I read these emails weeks after the event has occurred. And no one's assessed whether I understood what's going on with it. So it's not truly consent. But it is a process that demonstrates respect for parents and respects the dignity of parents, because it informs them and gives them an opportunity to decide about their kids' participation. So it's not really, we're not really consenting the parents, but it's this important piece of respect and involvement. The only time you can use opt-out consent, but when you use it is you use it when you meet criteria for a waiver of parental consent. And if you meet criteria for that waiver, you go ahead, request the waiver from the IRB, and then you propose a process where you inform parents of the research and give them that opportunity to opt out. So opt-out consent is really like sort of a subgroup of waivers where parents are given extra information. It is, perhaps even more rigorous than regular waivers of consent because there is some involvement because we involve parents in it. And this is for the diabetes prevention study. This was the approach that they took. They took an opt-out. They requested a waiver with giving parents the opportunity to opt out. For the sex education evaluation, they did similarly. The parents were already going to be informed about the educational program. They just added on information about the survey and the evaluation and gave them the opportunity to opt out of both. So both conditions that would have met waivers, but both in which the researchers opted to opt out. So, just sort of keeping in mind with opt-out consent, again, not really consent, but also it's oftentimes a nice way to demonstrate sort of respect for the parents and their role in schools. And that's it for school-based research. I'm open for questions.
First question, can you go to the slide with the cases on it? On our future talks, we're going to have an email in to ask questions from the virtual world.
Great idea.
But we haven't done that yet. So please email questions afterwards if you have questions, and we'll make sure Professor Ott will sit down and spend hours answering all questions. Anybody in the room have a question?
I have a couple questions for you. So obviously I'm thinking about doing some research. So a little bit more detailed. So what about attendance, absenteeism?
Yeah.
Is that considered
Yeah,
data?
that would be considered
model?
data. There's probably are ways to do it, but it would require careful work with the school and with the IRB.
And then my other question is, when looking at the exceptions with FERPA, and you're talking about administering student aid programs, right? Student aid, is that any sort of, for example, would that be in school clinic environments, or would that be any other type of aid? Or are we talking about student aid as in finances, which is how I think about it?
This particular context is all about financial aid. It's about financial information because FERPA applies not just to elementary and middle schools, but it applies to universities.
As well.
So if you look at our IU, IRB, SOP on the issue, it's really all about doing research with undergraduates. And consent for research with undergraduates, and there's less information on our SOP about doing research in primary and secondary schools, which is why we ended up doing this as a treats talk.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm going to probably have a conversation with you at some day in more detail.
Remind everybody who's got questions, you can always consult with the BSAP program or contact Mary. But I was going to follow up a question. So let's say you were going to track absenteeism before and after some kind of intervention, say, 10 weeks. So can they provide you that data in a de-identified way?
Sure. So I'm sure that there's that wouldn't be a problem. The problem would be like tracking it to individual students and getting like Sally Bluefin's attendance records before and after and whether she had participated in it. So you could get aggregate data.
Then asking them to track individual students with some kind of ID or something and signing all that. Obviously,
If we're trying to tie your research findings somehow.
And anyway, once the school's doing that, they're actually handling student data for research purposes. Even if they take it and de-identify the individual student data, I assume that's not going to be an easy answer at all either.
So yeah, that's not, I don't actually know if the school personnel were the people that had the codes linking it. And the other piece that you get into is just sort of like their role in the school and stuff like that. That it just, but it is, I mean, there are times when that those types of approaches have been used, like people doing research in prisons and juvenile prisons and having like the prison facility have someone on their side doing some of the data manipulation so that what you actually get.
Yeah, I wonder if you could flip it. So if you have a school-based clinical environment, right, so somehow the school, people in the school can be considered part of the healthcare team.
Yeah, and
then
then
you can have them do the linking.
Well, so in school-based clinics, you'd have to look at the structure of the school-based clinics, because some school-based clinics, the only thing the school does is provide them with space. But the actual records, medical records, treatments, etc., are all kept as health. Yeah, they're health records that might be through the Eskenazi system or Marion County Health Department or HealthNet or whatever, St. Vincent's, whatever health organization is actually running that school clinic. So there's also sort of thinking about where the information, then your information might come from two sources, where you might have school attendance records and clinic records.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be an issue with the younger kids because we're looking for parental permission. We're going to these schools.
And there are waivers for parental permission.
There are waivers for
pretty
parental permission.
Capacious waivers. I think you said, I mean, there's a long, and you
I'm not
said,
sure I would use the
not
word
capacious.
capacious.
Not big enough to drive a truck through a
Overstatement.
toy. Not big enough to drive a Tonka truck through.
There are, under specific circumstances, that are permissible from a regulatory and ethical standpoint. But there are certain circumstances.
I think this one uses the idea of some kind of intervention, behavioral intervention, or some kind of intervention to stop, to reduce absenteeism. That intervention itself would be minimal risk.
Yeah.
It wouldn't comprise the. It seems like that would be in the minimal risk.
No, you totally.
But you're not going to get a waiver for FERPA. Are there any equivalent waivers for FERPA?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
The real selling point here is FERPA, not parental permission.
It's not going to be. Yeah. And I mean, it is a good question. I don't know. And would this sort of piece about having a contractual relationship with the school, releasing the information.
Yeah.
The other thing is, are you going, like, how would you be able to get active parental consent? Like, could you bundle it with other things the kids need for consent if you did it at the front end of the school year? They're like clinic utilization. To use the clinic, they need a parental consent form. Can you bundle your study consent form with that consent form so that they would be signing them both at the like, because that the parents would get them both at the same time, so that it would be sort of a single point. Because the issue with schools and parental consent usually is not parents objecting to it, it's things being done without their knowing it. So it's that issue of control, and it's just issue of access. And it's my reading the email from the school 3 weeks late after the event has occurred. So
Yeah, I do that all the time too.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I missed that.
Yeah.
Usually I'm reminded by my wife that I did miss one.
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't know he has a trombone? Like, who knew he had a trombone? It was in your inbox 2 months ago. Other questions? Chelsea, you raised the issue about bias, like this issue that the people who are going to consent are going to be a subsection of the population, and possibly, as in the study you described, right, a subsection which is less representative of the problems you're trying to address.
Yeah. The question is, do they differ in ways that would be relevant to the research that you're doing? So the educational neuroscience one, it was going to get active parental consent because they, for a part of their study, were going to interview kids about their experiences in the classroom. So they were getting active consent. But it was one of these things where it was really like, what you were interested in was the teacher-student interaction that would be driven by the teacher, not whether or not the parent group sent the consent form. You know, so there may be situations where it may be less of an influence. I mean, the drug and alcohol screening study, it was clearly something like parental knowledge of participation was a big issue for these young people.
This is an issue for consent no matter what kind
Yes.
of research you're doing.
Yes.
So any clinical study,
Yeah.
any behavioral study, people agree to participate are always a weird
It's different.
subsection.
Yes,
and
yes.
You know, some
Yeah.
unusual characters as possible. I was going to ask also, so can you read one of your waiver slides? Because the thing about, it seemed like, again, I called it capacious. I meant like, now this one you talk about the behavioral neuroscience, right? So that's an intervention which is low risk, right? It's a sort of thing which is not a thing you would normally need consent for. So isn't that one also where you get a waiver of parental consent? Just because the intervention is minimal risk. You said at the very top, you know, I'm talking about interventions that are minimal risk. That seems to suddenly get you in the category where you're not going to have to worry about parental permission because you're going to get a waiver anyway.
Yeah.
That was my capacious thing.
And again, it's sort of, you get into situational issues. This is a 5th grade classroom. So the kids are sort of right at this cusp of what they're going to understand and consent for. And then thinking about community and schools as a special case of community engaged research. Like even I, who really am quite liberal in what my kids participate in, would want to know if someone were interviewing my 5th grader about teacher techniques in the classroom.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, so it's also, there are contextual pieces about it that you would want to make sure, like in this particular case, just having parental consent for that component. Her other component of her study was going to be classroom observation. And so she was going to get a waiver for the classroom observation and then do active parental consent for the actual interviews.
Oh, what was driving her to do the active parental consent for the interviews was not actually common rule subpart D, the part that applies to children, but actually this concern about
the fact that it was in the
mores.
school, FERPA, that you're doing research in schools with kids that are, I mean, FERPA doesn't have the subpart D exceptions.
Right, so the IRB would approve it. The problem was the school wouldn't approve it.
Well, our IRB would actually take FERPA into consideration.
They have to take all.
But in
all
the interviews,
regulations.
when it applied to FERPA, in the interview, the data being shared, the child is giving you, they're speaking to you. You're not getting school data from the school. I'm just trying to play around.
Yeah. So I think
just to try out these
the
different concepts
problem
you're
with
giving us.
FERPA is the regulations were written for data collected as part of the school day, and they're secondarily applied to research in school settings. So the regulations weren't actually, the regulations are about getting access to grades and attendance records and family stuff and other types of identifiable data. And so doing what they, but FERPA, it sort of encompasses as a piece of it this sort of research in the classroom, but it wasn't primarily written for research in the classroom. And because it wasn't primarily written for that purpose, it turns out that it's sort of like an imperfect fit when you're applying it. It's like even applying 45 CFR 46, the subpart D regulations were written at a time when people were thinking about biomedical research and randomized controlled trials in children. They weren't thinking about comparative effectiveness research. They weren't thinking about other biobanking, and they weren't thinking about long longitudinal studies. They were thinking about, get the new insulin in, see if the kid gets better in 2 months. And, so it's a case, again, like FERPA is like some of our other regulations. It's a case where the regulations weren't specifically designed for the context, so there's some interpretation.
We hit the mark on time here, 42 minutes by the clock. That's excellent.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Audience. Is there a way to shut me down?
Shut you down or shut I down the